Hail, this is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bring you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and, well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of our good friend Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Hi, Joel. How are we doing?
I'm just fine, Dr. Stan. Good to be with you again.
Well, tell us what we're going to be talking about this afternoon.
Well, let's talk about the economy, both here and abroad. There is no shortage of both optimists and doomsayers in today's world predicting either blissful economic recovery or imminent collapse of the dollar, the euro, and all other fiat currencies. Well, deciding who's right isn't really easy. The optimists can only be right if government continues to flood the markets with new money and credit, which they can do for a lot longer than people think without hyperinflation. And that's because of the base of the dollars is so high. The doomsayers should be right, but only if we judge the economy on the basis of real value and real money, which doesn't seem to really exist anymore. The major flaw in the imminent collapse camp is the failure to understand the depth of power and control insiders have over money creation, and the agility with which they can turn each new crisis into a recipe for more government intervention and false solutions. I'm reminded of what happened in 1994 in Italy, when there was that major blow-up where the entire government and all of the political parties were indicted for having relationships with payoffs to the mafia and other secret groups in Italy. It was such a big scandal that the government was overthrown. They had a completely, each of the parties were disenfranchised. And within 6 months, they'd all reformed the powers that be with different parties, new names, new figureheads to run them to appear like they were changed. And all of a sudden, the powers that be were back in power within 6 months. It was a dramatic representation how even when you have knowledge of a conspiracy in government and corruption, that in fact they can reform and pretend to be new and different, and the people will buy it. Well, the economy really is in trouble, but it's not an economic failure per se. It's one of dishonest money, falsified valuations, and the failure of legislative and judicial organs to investigate and prosecute those in government who are responsible for stealing the value people have put into government currency. Now, there's another factor, too. The fact that honest people and honest money can't turn this around because all of the incentives are toward this illusion that government can keep spending and never pay the consequences. Governments act as if they can continue to give foreign aid to every nation in the world, even when we have no surplus. And then we're running deficits of $1.4 trillion a year. People believe them and keep demanding aid to Israel and Egypt and every other cause being too big to fail. After all this has been going on, for decades, few really believe it will stop working, and that they should be the ones to bite the bullet if it does stop working. Everyone is willing to put it off till another day, and even those who see it are reluctant to talk about the horrible consequences when collapse comes.
But the longer you wait, the worse will be the consequences. And
Absolutely.
When you have to borrow money every day, how can you give away money to countries all throughout the world in the form of foreign aid, $30 billion, $35 billion a year, when you're having to borrow the money to give it away? It doesn't make any sense. But then we live in a world gone mad. There are only a few of us sane, and so many people think we're crazy. Go right ahead. Our guest, of course, is Joel Skousen. We'll be back in just a moment with Joel, and I think it's so vitally important. Question is, how long can they keep on going? And as long as they can convince the people that everything's going to be all right, just trust us. We'll be right back in a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty. Our guest this afternoon, as usual, on the Thursdays is Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. And Joel is saying that a lot of people say that the economy, everything, the monetary system is going to collapse. It could happen any time. But Joel says it's not going to collapse right now. It's almost inevitable that down the line it's going to collapse. The longer we wait, the more disastrous the results. But for the time being, certainly there's no other currency, and so many countries are holding our currency, and they have to rely upon our currency, because if they turn their back on it, they start to dump it, the whole thing will come down and they'll lose out. So Joel think this is going to go on. How long, Joel? How long will it be before we are going to have to do what needs to be done, and that is cut spending, increase taxes, and certainly try to get back to some sort of a financial stability? Or are we simply going to destroy the value of our currency and impoverish our people?
Well, it's too late to reform. It's too late to pay off the debt. It's beyond paying off. It's something like $133,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. Can never be paid off, period. So this is unfixable. And even if you try to cut a measly $35 billion, you have all of these special interest groups rising up and saying, not my benefits, not my benefits, let alone $1.4 trillion that you'd have to cut to balance the budget. I mean, think about that, Stan. You can't even cut $35 billion, let alone $500 billion that Rand Paul is proposing, and not certainly the $1.4 trillion that you need to even balance the budget. I mean, it's just incredible. I believe that even when the inevitable default is staring voters in the face that next week everything's going to collapse, there's no checks, there's not a single person that would vote to have their benefits cut, period. That's the way that people think nowadays. They would rather have phony money right up until the end than sacrifice. So the bottom line is that there's no way out of deficit spending. It's the only way that politicians can spend and buy votes without appearing to have to tax people to pay for it. All these foreign wars would stop in an instant if taxpayers got a $3,000 bill at the end of each month, and that's what it would cost. And that's why they deficit spend and promise tax cuts at the same time. It keeps the populace in a state of apathy with no great pain to suffer. Now, obviously, as we know, this can't go on forever. Eventually, either a default on interest payments arises, or inflation gets so high that interest rates can't rise itself and can't be repaid.
Okay, hold that thought. We'll be back here in just a moment with Joel Skousen. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Joel is simply pointing out that sooner or later comes the day of reckoning. The question is, will it be sooner or will it be later? But one of these days, of course, as the interest rates rise, of course, then the government has to pay the interest on the debt, and then there's no money to fund such things as Medicare and Social Security and the military and all the other things. Down the line, we get to the point where all of the money that the federal government can collect from taxation is going to pay interest on the debt. And then, of course, then you're going to have to face the day of reckoning, because that will probably be 10, 20 years down the road. But it's coming sooner or later. These things have happened many times before. There's another thing that can be done, though. Joe, they can simply inflate their way out. They can destroy the value of our currency. They can pay the debt off simply with worthless dollars. How about that as an alternative?
Well, it actually doesn't work either. Because if you try to inflate it out, the inflation rate rises and interest rates rise accordingly. And the interest rate accelerates. You still have to borrow, but the interest rates are so high that, there's no room to maneuver. For example, we've got about till 2024 before tax revenues are swallowed up by the interest payments on the debt. If they started to honestly show what the inflation is, inflation went to 15%. And they had to pay 15% or 16 or 17% interest, then that would accelerate the time when our tax revenues are absorbed by interest payments almost instantaneously down to into the teens, before 2020. So, that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, if you inflate away the dollars, frankly, you're not going to get anyone else to buy the debt. And then you're working strictly on inflation, pumping into it. Now, they can still keep this going for a lot more years than they think. They don't have to get to the point where they're let's put it into perspective. If the government inflated $10 trillion a year, that's approximately, about 2 to 3% of the outstanding money supply. So even $10 trillion, as huge as some of that is, isn't hyperinflationary. And people, lose sight of that the Fed really can continue to do this for a long time. But it can't go on forever. And I am of the strong feeling, that government will give itself an excuse to default on the debt, and that excuse will be a third world war. And that's why I think they're in a race, frankly, between when default looms its head and when they can talk or induce Russia and China to strike the West. And I think that part of this operation into northern Africa, which has cut off Chinese oil supplies from Libya. They had a large contract with Libya for oil. They have a large contract with Sudan, with Ethiopia. And if the U.S. continues to move down the continent like that and squeeze off the oil supply to China, it could be the inducement, as FDR knew that it would be to Japan by cutting off their oil supply that they had from Indonesia and other British empires, British colonies in the Far East. In fact, that was part of a 6-point plan of President Roosevelt to induce Japan to attack, is cutting off their oil supply. Well, the U.S. and all other countries are heading for the abyss, but the real question is, will they fail? If we mean fail and go away, the answer is no. Government is the power to act in ways larger than any individual can, so they will never go away. We will always have government upon us to dictate. This simply changes faces and leaders when you have the appearance of a collapse of government. You get new leaders like they did in Italy, and the same basic policies continue. But no government ever gives up the power to control money and wealth. If we mean that they fail economically and rise again with some of the false solutions, yes, that will happen. And there's no way to stop it. Even in the crisis of debt collapse, the people will always accept the superficial temporary solution rather than go back to real money, slow growth, and no government benefit. And, a lot of conservatives feel like, gee, if we just go back to real money, everybody would love it, and but they wouldn't love it. Because if you had real money where you could not inflate without actually increasing the supply of gold, mining more out of the ground, you would have very, very slow growth. And a lot of people are used to this steady inflation being pumped into the economy and the steady growth that comes with it. It can't be contained, though, as we know. It continues to get out of hand as more and more people want benefits. But even to dismantle the fiat money system requires that values return to that which is real, and few are willing to accept the consequences of real values. There is a reason why gold-backed currency can't compete with funny money. Dozens of free market people have tried to create gold-based currency in the free market to compete against the declining dollar. Now, of course, you have the problem that the government tries to prosecute them for competing or issuing fraudulent currency, which is not legal tender. But there is a demand for this thing, but it's only to buy the gold and store it, not to spend it. I want to emphasize that a great deal. The old adage is true. Bad money drives good money out of circulation. That's because people will naturally hoard money that has real value, like gold and silver, and spend paper dollars that are depreciating. Now, in my consulting work, I sometimes express a desire to like-minded clients who have gold and silver to see if they'd like to pay me in real money, gold or silver, coins, instead of dollars. But then you see, even though they believe in gold or silver, you see this reluctance on their face. And it's because the gold coin in their pocket is appreciating while it's in its reserve status. While it's sitting in the pocket, the coin is appreciating. So if they pay me in gold, if they give me that gold coin in exchange for my services at today's rate, the gold coin sits in my pocket now, and then it starts gaining value for me. He still has the dollars that he could have given me that he didn't. He gave me the gold coin instead of the dollars, and the dollars sitting in his pocket are depreciating every day. So you can see why people hoard the gold and spend the dollars. You would too. Everyone would. And that's why gold and silver will not get into common circulation unless there is no fiat currency to compete with it. Bad money always drives out good.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right, because you could have a system where, as we had before 1971, you might have $1 on deposit for every $6 or $8 that is created by the banking system. Basically, the banks create money based upon the gold and silver, or things of real value. Prior to 1971, our money was tied to gold, so they could not expand the money supply. And, of course, once they took away the gold anchor, then the ship of state really began to speed, and it gathered more and more speed, and we've had a great time over this last 40 years. We've had great prosperity, great fortunes, and paper money been made in real estate and in the stock market and all sorts of speculation. You didn't do that. You couldn't make that sort of money in a stable society where you had a limited, a certain amount of currency. But if we don't get back to that, Joel, sooner or later it's going to happen. And when it does, why heaven help the people who certainly have invested in paper money, and all of their life savings are in paper money and a fiat money system. Anybody who understands the history of fiat money knows that sooner or later why there's going to be the day of reckoning coming.
Well, let me clarify a little bit about the gold standard as we're talking about it. First of all, it isn't enough to say that currency is issued based upon gold. That's what the euro is. The euro supposedly is a gold-backed currency because the European Central Bank has a stash of gold. But it isn't a gold standard. And the reason it isn't is because the currency is not redeemable in gold at a certain fixed amount, or any amount whatsoever. But the dollar was. When the dollar was a reserve currency, it was a gold note, and it was redeemable at the Treasury in gold. And that's what made it redeemable. That's what made the Federal Reserve on the hook, or the Treasury on the hook for the Federal Reserve notes. And so there's a real difference between saying, we've got so much gold, we're going to issue, 10 bills per ounce of gold, etc. It doesn't mean a thing unless they're redeemable in gold, that you can trade the paper in for gold. That's the only way that the government can get stuck printing too much paper, is that people start to collect on the gold, as France did in various other countries. They started redeeming Federal Reserve notes in gold, and that's when Nixon shut the gold window. But you see, we'll never go back to that point again, because government, of course, doesn't have or doesn't want to reveal what it has in gold. They don't want the gold in the hands of the American people. And every currency now in the world, without exception, is a fiat currency. There isn't a single gold-backed currency, redeemable currency in the world. And that's an advantage for the dollar, because it means, it's an advantage for a lot of people, including those who are competing with the dollar, like the euro. They love it when the U.S. Federal Reserve does quantitative easing. When they start throwing money out there, it just means that the Europeans can create more money too. And all they have to do is just a little less than the dollar, a little less inflation than the dollar, and their currency rises. But they're all kind of hiding in the shadow of U.S. inflation, and that's why none of these currencies are worth anything really. And the euro, of course, is showing its great weakness in the fact that the European Union is pretty close to bankruptcy, with the debt valuations of Greece, Spain, and Portugal.
Well, Joel, we're beginning to see the ravages of inflation. Perhaps not hyperinflation, but at least John Williams thinks we have about a 10% inflation now, probably a 15%, 14% by the end of this year, based upon the producer price index, and maybe up to 20% next year. It doesn't take very long before we really begin to destroy the value of our currency and our savings, especially when, of course, your Social Security check is tied to inflation, and the government claims there isn't any, simply lies. But, of course, when you go to the store, your check buys less and less every single month. The price of food's up, price of fuel is up, price of clothing is up, price of many imports is up. And unless you're buying a home where the price has fallen, why, you're in real trouble. Joel, go right ahead.
Well, I will agree that inflation is rising. Inflation is rising not because of internal demand. In reality, it's rising externally because of the devaluation of the dollar. Through a lot of these dollars that the Fed has created have been sent overseas, and so they're really fat on dollars, and a lot of them are buying up commodities as a way of protecting their value, exchanging the dollars for things of real value. So it's driving up commodity prices, and that's what's driving up a lot of other things. But there is even an inflation mentality of various corporations who don't have a high commodity basis. They're simply raising their prices because they're now beginning to see that there is an expectation of rising prices, and they can hide behind it. But without the ability of the consumer to raise its prices, this will result in stagflation, and that's what we're dealing with here. So let me go back to the big picture of what's going on in the economy. Let's talk about the deflationary forces. There are powerful deflationary forces going on. Declining values in used homes, derivatives, and other commodities, or contracts, like derivative contracts that are driven up by false valuations and then false incentives to buy, and then they collapse. So let's look at home values specifically because it's such a big portion of the U.S. economy. Home values were driven up falsely by three primary mechanisms. One, artificially induced low mortgage rates. Two, government incentives and mortgage guarantees that allowed bankers to make loans to millions of people who were incapable of surviving the slightest economic downturn. That's a recipe for foreclosure. Number three, the creation of a system of packaging mortgages as securities with false valuations in collusion with the rating agencies and credit agencies. And that allowed the bankers to sell all the mortgages that they were creating to investors. Many of those were overseas in pension funds, and thus freeing up money to make more loans. That created a Ponzi-like cycle. In other words, you induce all these people to come in, come on in, we'll give you special deals, we have adjustable rate mortgages, no down payment, we'll even pay you to take out a mortgage. They had no business lending to these people, but the only way they were doing it is because, one, it was guaranteed by the government, and number two, they were repackaging it. It used to be, when you and I went to get our first mortgage on a house, the bank would often say, no, we don't have any mortgage money to lend here until some people pay back their mortgages. But now they can get any amount of money they want from the Fed at a discount rate, and then they can write the mortgages, sell it upline, and then they've freed up that money again, at least 95% of it, to loan again to other people. So they can continue on about a 10-to-1 ratio to continue to use the same money to keep loaning and loaning. Now, all three elements went into the creation of a huge bubble in housing that burst once they ran out of new buyers who could qualify under the giveaway rate. Actually, the bubble burst once the rate of new buyers peaked and started to decline. Because when it started to decline, the people in the mortgage industry said, we've run out of buyers. We've given loans to everybody who can afford one, and we're running out of buyers. It's peaked and it's starting down now. That's when they started to short the market. That's when derivative-style insurance policies on these mortgage-backed securities kicked in, and losers started to demand payment from insurers like AIG. Now, the derivative underwriters didn't have the money, and so a bailout was necessary. Now that the bubble has burst, we can ask, where did all the money go?
Hold that thought. We'll be right back with Joel Skousen. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is just describing how this whole fraudulent scam went as far as the housing market. And it was great, they were lending money to everybody. All you needed was a pulse. You didn't even necessarily need a pulse. They would sell you a house under any circumstances, nothing down, will give you money. You don't have to be able to pay it. Go ahead, lie about your assets, lie about your income, lie about your job. They called it liar's loan, and everybody was lying, and you could buy not one home, but two homes, because, of course, then you could make twice as much money when you rolled them over. And then, of course, when the market reversed, there was nobody, they ran out of people to buy the new homes. Then, of course, the cascade of defaults kicked in, and then, of course, the derivatives that had been used to guarantee the mortgage-backed securities, the MBS, or the collateralized debt obligation, which were nothing more than bonds that were made up of mortgages faulty mortgages with AAA ratings and guaranteed by all these rating agencies that were totally fraudulent. And of course, they guaranteed the price would be stable, but they were insurance policies with no money behind them. And this then got into the collapse of those companies, and then, of course, the derivatives that bought to guarantee that they would be able to make payments, they began to fail, and so they had to begin to collect money from the people who had the derivatives, people like AIG. But AIG didn't have any money, so the federal government had to give them $182 billion, as I remember. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, that's right. And what is both evil and ironic is that the largest share of the billions of dollars made during the run-up went to those who sold MBSs to investors. Billions in bonuses were doled out in Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers and J.P. Morgan Chase. The money is never coming back. Sadly, the big insider banks who created this mess, who paid out all those bonuses, got reimbursed in the bailout. So in essence, they got paid twice. Homeowners who sold during the run-up, of course, made out like bandits as long as they moved to a cheaper housing market to reinvest their inflated gains. That's what drove up housing markets in Florida and Las Vegas, money being reinvested from people selling out in the Northeast and moving to Florida, or Californians bailing out of their high-priced markets and moving to Las Vegas. Now there are hundreds of thousands of homes sitting vacant in the desert in Vegas. So deflation is merely a negative and an inevitable reaction to an inflationary spike. That's why we have deflation going on at the same time as other prices are still inflating. Deflation is actually only happening in markets that were excessively inflated due to falsified demand pressures created by government policy. Now, home prices are still declining nationwide due to the huge backlog of foreclosed homes on the market. Why should anyone buy a non-distressed home when he can pick up any number of homes in foreclosure that are selling for a third less? Here's another key element. Foreclosed homes are selling at 1/3 to 1/2 of what they can be built for. New. That's why few new homes are being built. New home prices are incapable of coming down to below cost unless the builder's going bankrupt. And the cost of labor and materials in a new home has not decreased all that much. So while there's much less talk on business shows about the green shoots of recovery, everyone with a vested interest in the market wants to keep believing in the best case scenario. A real estate professional who was touted as a realist was saying on the nightly business report that it would take at least a year or two for the current crop of foreclosed homes to be liquidated, and he was predicting prices would then start to rise. Well, that's good thinking, except that he was working from the assumption that the foreclosures are declining, and that is not yet true. The backlog of foreclosures cannot be liquidated unless the rate of foreclosures declines significantly, so that the homes that are sold in foreclosure can start to eat down on the backlog. Once that happens, then you can talk about 1 to 2 year period it takes to liquidate the backlog of foreclosed homes. Now, sadly, commentators don't really know how much inventory is out there because banks have been holding so many properties off the market in an attempt to keep prices from collapsing further. So the real economy is where normal people operate. Real jobs, real services, and real domestic manufacturing, some of which is suffering from deflation. Right now, the economy we're experiencing is pretty close to what it should be. Not a lot of debt driving purchases. If the government would just let things alone, business and employment would adjust over time to this lower level of growth and things would stabilize.
But they're not going to do that. They're going to keep trying to prop it up.
That's my next line. That's not
go right ahead. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, that's because the insiders who played the speculative economy didn't want to suffer the consequences of the financial bubbles that they created. The bailouts were for them, not Main Street.
That's true, and of course, basically the bankers, they're still getting these phenomenal salaries, but behind this, I think that there really are other forces at work. They're not necessarily logical, because if you're looking at what's going on to date for real logic, sometimes things are happening that are not logical. We'll be back in just a moment here.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea,
Joel, you go right ahead.
Well, let's look now at the speculative economy. Today we're experiencing mostly inflation with only a few sectors like housing and autos under deflation. The real economy is very much subject to the excesses of money creation and government spending. And, which trickles down constantly to most sectors of human endeavor. People always tend to think this is the real economy, so accustomed have they become to constantly rising prices and business growth. But the smart money of the insiders was never satisfied with normal growth. And in the past 2 decades, the speculative side of money making, or making money just on trades, has grown way out of proportion to the real economy. I'm one of the few analysts that have made the point that the speculative economy is now almost a third the size of the real economy, and that money never crosses over, or very little of it crosses over to the real economy. It just churns in speculative futures and margin calls and just making money by trading. During the business and housing bubble in the last decade, so many smart people got in on this run-up in stocks and growth that a huge speculative market developed as a way of parking their new riches in ways that gave much higher returns than savings, which were way out of proportion to even normal business investments in the real economy. The insiders were playing these markets, and millions of others saw the profits they were making and jumped on the bandwagon. Most of them got shaken off the wagon during the bust. The speculative economy has become the main recipient of money creation simply because its players are in large part the recipients of bailouts and zero-rate interest loans directly from the Fed. Insider investors are no longer satisfied with 8% cap rates in the commercial real estate market. They wanted the huge returns that only hedges, derivatives and futures markets could provide, or Forex currency markets, where they could buy on margins of up to 10%. That's how bubbles are built. And just as bad money drives that good in the currency markets, Ponzi scheme investments, when they have official guarantees, lure money out of sound, slow-growing investments in the real economy to the speculative market. And that's one of the reasons why there isn't any recovery going on in the real market.
Hold that thought there. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Chris Joel is simply talking about the money's been driven out of the real market into the speculative market to get rich fast schemes, and you can borrow money from the federal government from 0.25% interest and then invest it in a hedge fund at 10% income, or in bonds, secure bonds at 2 or 3%. Well, you'd be crazy now if you're bankers. You and I can't do that, but of course the big banks can borrow money at 0.25%. Lend it back to the government that they borrowed money from for 2.5% or 3%. What's wrong with this picture? And of course, the banks get richer, and us common people, well, we can't play that game. And of course, we can't get into those markets to get into the hedge funds. Some of those hedge funds are returning 10, 20%. Of course, you're taking an awful chance you get into a hedge fund. But right now, before we go on, Joel, I want you to tell our listeners how they can subscribe to World Affairs Brief, and then we'll get back to this discussion of the sad state of the economy, and of course, what I think is even going to be a sadder state for our people down the line. But go right ahead.
Well, the World Affairs Brief is showcased on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. Listeners can get a free sample copy, as always, by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. On the website, people will all see a rundown of each of my books that I've written in the preparedness field as well. I'm of the philosophy that as we fight for our freedom, we still need to prepare for a takedown or for war that the powers that may be will bring upon us. And my 3 major books are The Secure Home, everything from A to Z on high security and self-sufficiency construction in architecture and remodeling. Second book, my bestseller, is The Strategic Relocation, 3rd edition, all new color maps and everything about finding safe places within North America, as well as contingency planning if you can't afford a retreat or you have to stay within the large cities. And the last book is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home, architectural plan book on building a safe room within a basement. And all 3 of these books are available from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800 5448927. They're among our best sellers. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, the billions that were made in the speculative markets lured in most major investment and financial brokerage firms. None could compete in the marketplace for investment clients without producing high returns, and those high returns were only possible in these speculative markets. So slowly over time, the whole world of investment was put at risk with these speculative bets, all built on margin purchases when they came falling down. And fall they did, but since so many institutionalized investors had been suckered into this field, there was a universal incentive to accede to government's call for a bailout. The quickest way to stop all this is to prohibit market buying and require huge reserves to be set aside for derivatives, just like any insurance policy. Taking money out of circulation to cover these bets means that they will have to charge much higher fees to buy into the scheme, slowing down profits and demand. Well, we're never going to see the days of the Weimar German-style hyperinflation. Sadly, too many commentators on the right are throwing out the hyperinflation threat when they're really only talking about 15 to 20% inflation. It's bad enough. But hyperinflation is when prices are doubling and tripling in short intervals of time, and that's why things are different. This is the reason things are different today. First of all, the base of money supply, as I mentioned earlier, is so much larger than it was in Germany. The Fed can inflate $1 trillion a week and barely dent the hundreds of trillions of dollars outstanding. Second, without an automatic payment system from government directly into the pockets of consumers, most people don't have any way to increase income to compensate for rising prices. The result is stagflation and the devastation of buying power for everyone on wages and fixed income. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't see harmful inflation. 20% inflation will be enough to cause everyone to start spending dollars just to beat the rising prices. Raw commodity prices are exceeding that rate of inflation. The only reason that it doesn't fully get passed on to the consumer is the raw cost is but a small portion of the finished goods price. So manufacturers can absorb a fair amount of that raw goods inflation, which is high. Still, inflation is beginning to hurt, and it doesn't help that government has a pernicious habit of understating inflation, as John Williams has so often pointed out in his website. What I hope my readers understand is that the Fed's money creation is not being directly injected into the economy, as it was in Weimar Germany. The majority is going to other big banks, especially in Europe, as the Fed is assisting the ongoing bailout there. Another large chunk of bailout money has gone into bank reserves, which are the highest in history. Interesting that banks are saying, well, we don't have any money to lend, but their reserves now are the highest in history, but they're all parked with the Fed, which doles out generous interest rates so that cooperating banks can remain solvent. That's one of the primary reasons why banks aren't lending. Why should they take a risk with future bad loans when they can get a solid 3% from the Fed without any risk at all? So, Paul Craig, go ahead.
No, go right ahead. That's something people really don't understand, is that in the past, the Fed didn't pay interest rates. Now they're paying interest rates, and basically, by so doing, they're pulling money out of the economy. And people don't understand this is a new policy, and of course it means that the banks don't have the money to lend. Well, why should they lend it and take a chance when they can get interest, even maybe a smaller amount of money from the Fed, but it's totally secure? So another means by which they're starving the loan market. But go ahead.
Well, Paul Craig Roberts had a very devastating opinion piece this week. He said, although the financial press speculates about a downgrade of U.S. government credit rating and default if political impasse prevents the debt ceiling from being raised, I doubt anyone really believes the debt ceiling will not be raised. It is just all part of the political theater over the next couple of months. He's absolutely correct. The debt limit will be raised. But, it doesn't make any difference. It's just like the Patriot Act. They surveil everyone in every email and every telephone conversation. Everything I'm saying is being recorded by the NSA. And so the Patriot Act was just cover a lot of it so that they could convince their own employees, who are often faithful, good patriotic Americans, that they aren't doing something illegal. But in fact, they've already surpassed the debt limit, and nobody raised an eyebrow. They've surpassed the 60 days time limit for the War Powers Act of being in a foreign country of intervention. They blew right past that, and Congress didn't say a thing, and the President didn't say a thing. course, Republicans will blame the budget deficit and accumulated national debt on Medicare and Social Security. Wall Street sees billions of profits in privatization. Either the debt rating agencies will oblige their Wall Street paymasters by opining from time to time that U.S. Treasury bonds might be downgraded unless entitlements can be addressed. And Democrats will say that the budget deficit cannot be addressed without an increase in tax revenues, especially upon the rich, whose tax rates have declined. All the while, the pressure on the approaching deadline for default will be used to reshape the U.S. social contract, most likely to the further interest of the government. Well, Paul Craig Roberts says, however, regardless of whether the debt ceiling is raised, the U.S. government is not going to go out of business. He's absolutely right. Why does anyone think that the president, who does not obey the War Powers Act, who does not obey the FISA law, that's Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, U.S. and international laws against torture, or any of the laws or procedures that guard civil society, is going to feel compelled to obey the debt ceiling? Absolutely true. As long as the U.S. is at war, the American president is a Caesar, he's above the law, and they can justify anything because we're in a war. Moreover, he says the Federal Reserve is independent of government in its approach to regulatory matters and bailouts. The Fed has ceased to follow its own rules. Regardless of the debt ceiling, the Fed will continue to purchase the Treasury's bond issues, and the Treasury will continue to fund the federal deficit with its proceeds. Goldman Sachs is too big to fail, and so is the U.S. government. As I say, Stan, I think what's really going to happen, of course, is that the government will bring us a war. That war will destroy the cities of New York City and Washington, D.C. They'll come out of their bunkers and they'll say, voila, there is no debt anymore because all the records are gone and we simply have to start all over. And no one will flinch an eye. They'll just say, do anything, everything to save us. And I think that's how they're going to get out of this situation.
Well, it could very well be. I'm very much afraid that there are going to be dire consequences from what's coming down the line, and all we can do, of course, is just wait and watch and see. But the one thing I think that's going to end up is that an awful lot of people are going to be impoverished. Certainly we cannot have government providing from everybody from the cradle to grave. There just is not enough money out there, and furthermore, there are too many older people like me around in their 80s, and a growing number of older people who've been promised that the government's going to provide our Social Security and our Medicare, and there's no way in the world they can possibly do it because there are fewer and fewer young people entering into the labor market and more older people retiring, and a recipe for a sure disaster.
Well, the artificially engineered U.S. recovery is already starting to falter. In a continual procession of disappointing data confirms the truth. Recent numbers on GDP, durable goods, housing, regional manufacturing, initial unemployment claims, and leading economic indicators all indicate a sharp downturn in GDP growth. Just today, the employment report showed that the private sector added a paltry 38,000 jobs in May, down from 177,000 jobs in April, significantly below expectations, and the weakest number since September 2010. Just yesterday, Case-Shiller announced that the U.S. housing market officially achieved a double dip in the national home prices have given up the entire 5% bounce they achieved after the May 2009 lows. And Goldman Sachs is betting that the oil price will rise to some $135 a barrel, and that service stations will likely be jacking up fuel prices to $5 a gallon. Well, they must know something, Stan, about an upcoming military intervention around the world, probably Iran, because they're predicting this while oil prices are going lower. There's only one thing that can make that happen, and that's a war somewhere. Goldman Sachs is an insider company. If they're betting on oil going to $135 a barrel, you can bet that one of the oil-producing countries is going to be under attack, and I'll bet that is Iran. As I covered in last week's World Affairs Brief, the media didn't cover this, but over half or almost half of Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to the AIPAC conference, the Israeli lobby, was attacking Iran. And yesterday, the foreign minister of Israel talked openly about an attack on Iran, and my sources indicate that in Iraq, Israeli planes are using U.S. air bases there to practice for such an attack. So this could very well be what Goldman Sachs is betting on.
Now, you're speaking now that Iraq is going to let the Israelis use their air bases to attack Iran. Is this what you're suggesting?
No, I'm saying that the U.S. bases under U.S. control are already being used by Israel, and there are Israeli planes there practicing attack probes in and around Iran.
In other words, these are coming from Iraqi air bases controlled by the U.S.
That's right. They're not Iraqi. There are U.S. air bases in Iraq.
All right, fine. Well, I think that this is certainly very reasonable, and I don't know if you noticed, but the Senate voted to allow drilling at Anwar, and I don't know whether it went through the House, but I suspect that they're going to start drilling up there, so that when the price gets to up $150 to $200 a barrel, why, of course, they'll have plenty of oil here, and they will cut off the supplies from overseas. But you would think that would be front-page news. It was just a little clip up there on the Internet. They agreed to allow drilling at Anwar, so they have to know that there's going to be a shortage of oil down the line, but then not letting the American people know that it's authorized. Of course, it'll be, 4 or 5 years before that oil comes online. But why now? Are they suddenly going to allow drilling there? I think that this is all scripted, just like you say.
Yes, I've always long held that the U.S. has been beefing up the environmental unions, environmental groups in order to keep the U.S. from tapping into their own oil supplies, reserving them for wartime when it comes, when we won't have access to foreign oil. And that's why we're using foreign oil now and playing as if, environmental regulations keep us from tapping on others. There are other whistleblowers in the oil industry that have indicated the Anwar oil wilderness has already been tapped and drilled, just like the ones that Pastor Lindsay talked about in the Gulf region, the Gulf of Alaska, that have been capped. So I think that there's a great deal that the U.S. has they're not admitting to.
There's a massive big oil field down in southern Texas. I've forgotten the name of it, but they're spending billions of dollars down there to develop that oil field, and they're putting in the oil wells, and then they're capping them. I mean, they're putting in, a dozen or two a week. Why are they doing this? Why aren't we hearing about it? Why are they capping most of those wells? Why aren't they getting the oil out now? Well, of course, they're waiting for the price to go up. But they can't tell the American people that. And if we don't know what's going on, why, we have no idea that the country has more oil and knows what to do with. But if that was known, why, the price would come down. And they don't want the price to come down. After all, if you want to make money, you create artificial shortages. You finance the environmental movement to campaign against the drilling there, and that's exactly why the oil companies have been financing the environmental movement, and now one American in 1,000 understands what's really going on.
Well, part of the doomsayers on the economy, I think, don't understand that the powers that be are ones who control. Technically speaking, of course, we have all of the weakness involved in the economy that it should have a collapse, especially the dollar. But, in fact, Peter Yastow of Yastow Origer, the former DT trading man, said on CNBC, we're on the verge of a great, great depression. The Federal Reserve knows it, and it's going viral today. Well, he said, as I pointed out Tuesday, billion-dollar fund managers agree the government never fixed the underlying problems with derivatives, so there's going to be another crash. Well, I'm not so sure, because they fail to realize that all of these derivatives are under the control of people that they have a finger on. And essentially, if they don't want those to collapse, they can make all kinds of underlying promises under the table and say, look, we'll take care of it. Don't make an issue out of this. They could suppress it. If they want to crash, they certainly have all of the things up in the air necessary to do that. Now, the economy is actually weakening. Mike Duke of Walmart talked about a very interesting phenomenon that they track at Walmart stores. He says, we're seeing core customers under a lot of pressure. His core customers, of course, the low working class people, and who are very subject to the rising fuel prices. Walmart shoppers, many of whom live paycheck to paycheck, typically shop in bulk at the beginning of the month when their paychecks come in. He says lately they're running out of money at a faster clip. At the end of the month, we're seeing a dramatic drop in purchases at Walmart.
Well, I know we certainly see that to an extent, even in our little mail order business we have here at Radio Liberty. And other than your books, which are still bestsellers. Why, we are not selling. We've got one of the finest collections of tape sets and CD sets and videos and DVDs and books you'll find any place. But people just are a little reluctant to buy, and I understand why they feel that reluctance. There's an air of uncertainty in today, and people really need to understand how this all fits together under the control of the Brotherhood of Darkness. Well, Joel, you've got 3 minutes there to wrap up the program.
Let's talk a little bit about the economic situation in the world, especially in Europe. Greece has just gotten a second bailout for another 3-year lease on life, and even though Germany claimed that it was against any bailouts, they went along and agreed to it. And the real reason is that German banks are the ones that loan most of the money secretly to Greece. So if Greece defaults, the German banks are left hanging with that. And that's the reason why Germany went along. The bailout is actually going to the German banks, not to Greece itself. So this is a very interesting how it makes it appear as if, the target of all this largesse is Greece, but in fact it's the German banks who caused the problem by helping Greece evade the requirement in the European Union to keep their inflation within 3.5% of the value of the euro. See, each of the countries in the European Monetary Union print their own euros, but they're required to not print more than 3.5% per year in excess of their tally. And Greece was fudging this, and so Spain and Portugal, by borrowing under the table what they couldn't finance through inflation and taxes. And, of course, Greece has retirement of age 50 for many of its public workers, which outrages many German workers. But things are not as they seem. As I say, I don't think any of these governments are going to go down. They will just keep bailing them out, and the European Union will continue to float along as it always has until war comes, because obviously they need something ultimately. When this latest bailout unwinds, Greece missed all of its targets. Greece would probably have to sell half of its public assets just to survive, and it's not going to happen.
Well, what about Portugal, though? What about Spain? What about Italy? Who's going to bail them out?
Well, the European Union will do it. They claim that they're not, but they will, just like Germany swore up and down they wouldn't be a second bailout, and they were the first ones to approve it. So, as I say, the rhetoric is one thing, but when push comes to shove, they will do what they have to do to keep saving the big banks.
Yeah, well, of course, and what impact will that have on the average German working person?
Well, it won't have any direct impact, except that it will be inflationary over time, just like it is an impact to the U.S. The German economy is still carrying most of the European Union, and it will continue to do so.
Okay, we're out of time, Joel. God bless you. Thanks very much, and we'll look forward to talking to you early tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Sam. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. And that guest, of course, has been Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Well, this is Dr. Stan. We do hope you enjoy our weekly conversations with Joel. Always provocative, always very, very thoughtful. Joel pointing out now that they're simply going to continue inflation, 10, 20% a year. It doesn't take very long before this begins to erode the value of everything you have and lower your living standards. It's going to have to happen in Europe because, of course, Germany now is going to bail out. Greece looks like they'll bail out the other countries there. They won't default. They'll simply inflate it, and in so doing, they'll impoverish the people over there until, of course, the war comes, and then they can destroy everything and kill hundreds of millions of people and start in all over again. The war is planned, there's no question. This is why, of course, we gave Pakistan the wherewithal to build their nuclear weapons, and we even financed that. And when we found out that they were still building nuclear weapons there in Pakistan, they said, Imagine that. Well, we had no idea they were giving them all this money, and we thought it was going to be used just to finance Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and they're building a nuclear weapon. Well, they didn't say that, but they know that they were financing the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Of course, if we didn't give money to Pakistan and they didn't finance the Taliban, Al Qaeda, where would they get their ammunition to kill our boys with? Where would they get the rifles and the money and the grenades and all the explosive devices? You have to have an enemy, ladies and gentlemen. It's the old adage, if you don't have an enemy, how can you have a war? It's exactly what happened in World War II. It's exactly what happened in Vietnam, where we were funding Russia, that was funding the North Vietnamese, was funding the Viet Cong. It's what's going on over in the Near East today, and we're in for real trouble because, of course, we're actually toppling all the governments over there, uniting them under the Muslim Brotherhood, which we funded going back to the period right after the Second World War. You need to get the book, The Devil's Game. The Devil's Game. You need to read our newsletters. You need to understand the Second World War. That's, of course, John Loftus's book, Nazis, the American Nazi Secret, going into how American corporations were building the weapons for good old Adolf, that were used at Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge to kill American soldiers. America's Nazi Secret. Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Professor Sutton. Charles Hyam, Trading with the Enemy. Creating the best enemy money could buy, just like we're doing today. Our number, 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. If you want Ambassador Dodd's letter to Colonel House, we'll be glad to send that to you free of charge. If you just ask for it, you need to get the information. You need to talk to people to explain to them how wars come about. You create an enemy. Just like Machiavelli said, just like George Orwell said, just like we did in World War II, and certainly in Vietnam, just like we're doing today, creating the best enemy money could buy in the Near East, the Middle East, and in preparation for the coming war. Remember the book, The Devil's Game. Who financed the Muslim Brotherhood? Why, look in the mirror, ladies and gentlemen. Look in the mirror and weep. I said, we hope if you're in a position to help Radio Liberty so we can expand our message. And where we expand our message, more and more people get involved, and we are having impact. It is encouraging. If you'd like to join the Radio Liberty family of supporters, our telephone number, 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. At our website, radioliberty.com. Don't forget there is a conspiracy conference. It's in the Marriott Hotel, the Great American Parkway, over there in Santa Clara. We'll have a booth. We won't be talking, but we will have a table there for the dinner. Again, our number, 1-800-544-8927. Please pray for America. Pray for revival, because if we don't have revival, we're going to lose America. Pray for our Congressman Ron Paul and Jerry Corsi, but please pray for Radio Liberty, our provision and protection.